The morning sun spilled across the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, gilding the black iron gates in a pale shimmer. The rhythmic click of boots echoed against the stone, sharp and steady, every step measured with centuries of tradition. Tourists hushed as the red tunic and tall black bearskin of a royal guard came into view, a figure of discipline framed against the grandeur of the palace facade. Cameras lifted, children pressed close to the rope line, and for a moment the courtyard held a reverent stillness. Then came the low growl of an engine. A sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the edge of the plaza, polished like obsidian, its chrome gleaming under the August sun. The door swung open, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his voice carrying over the silence like a blade through cloth. "Is this it?" he scoffed. A soldier, dressed like a toy, marching in circles. Heads turned, murmurs rippled, and the mood shifted. Out of the hush came a man whose voice did not belong, a billionaire CEO, draped in arrogance, stepping forward with words sharp enough to slice through reverence. And when his hand struck the guard's face, the entire forecourt froze. What happened next shocked everyone. Before we show you exactly what unfolded in those tense minutes, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. At Wellington Barracks, just a short march from Buckingham Palace, Guardsman Thomas Rennick had begun his day long before the tourists ever gathered. The ritual was familiar, almost sacred in itself. The brushing of scarlet wool until not a single fleck of lint remained, the polishing of brass buttons until they caught the light like fire, and the careful adjustment of the bearskin that crowned his head with a dignity larger than any man. Rennick was 29, Coldstream Guards, his frame broad-shouldered and upright from years of drill and deployment. To the casual eye, he was just another soldier in the line, another motionless figure meant to impress visitors. But those who served beside him knew the truth. A tour in Helmand had left a pale scar running across his jawline, faint under the morning light, but a memory etched deep into his bones. He had carried comrades to safety under mortar fire. He had stood in the dust of villages where silence was a warning, not a tradition. This morning, as he checked the alignment of his rifle against his shoulder, none of that showed. To the public, he was duty incarnate, rigid, silent, unyielding, and that was the point. His role was not to display himself, but to embody centuries of discipline, a living reminder that behind ceremony lies sacrifice. Inside, however, Rennick's thoughts carried the quiet weight of those memories. Each button fastened was not just uniform, but armour. Each step he would take on the palace forecourt was not simply a drill, but a promise that he would hold the line, no matter the provocation. He had learned in Helmand that the measure of a soldier was not in noise or spectacle, but in steadiness when tested. When he left the barracks and took his post in front of Buckingham Palace, rifle balanced, eyes fixed forward, he became that steadiness. Children laughed nearby, some whispering to their parents if he ever blinked, others daring each other to make him smile. Tourists snapped photos, but Thomas Rennick did not move. His stillness was not emptiness, it was presence. A presence that said tradition mattered, that respect still had a place in a world often too quick to forget. Every inch of him, from the gloss of his boots to the line of his jaw, spoke silently, "This ground is guarded, this duty is alive." And when the time came, as poignant as it always did, for someone to test that silence, Rennick was ready. Not eager, not brash. Ready. The forecourt of Buckingham Palace was alive with the energy of a summer morning. Sunlight glanced off the gilded tips of the black railings, and the Union Jack rippled against a sky brushed pale blue. The soundscape was a mixture of hushed awe and quiet chatter. The rhythmic shuffle of trainers on stone, the murmur of guides raising little flags to gather their groups, and the occasional click of cameras breaking the reverent air. Children leaned eagerly against the ceremonial rope line, their fingers gripping the cord as they tried to get as close as possible. Parents reminded them to stay back, though even the adults could not disguise their excitement at being so near the famed guards. For most, This was not just sightseeing. It was brushing shoulders with history itself. Near the centre rail stood a father in his 40s, broad-shouldered and kindly, with his 8-year-old daughter balanced against his leg. She looked up at the motionless guardsman, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his sleeve, "why doesn't he move? Isn't he bored?" The father bent down, his voice low and patient. "It's not about being bored, love. It's about respect. That guard is showing the world that nothing can shake his duty. Not weather, not noise, not even people trying to make him laugh. It's how we remember the soldiers who stood before him." The little girl nodded solemnly, her hand tightening around the small paper flag she carried. A few paces away, an older man in his late 70s stood with a teenage granddaughter at his side. His tweed cap sat neatly on his head, and pinned to his jacket was a regimental badge, tarnished but still proud. His name was Arthur Hale, and his eyes, weathered by years of service in Northern Ireland, never left the guard's steady figure. "That's duty, Emily," he said quietly to his granddaughter. "That lad out there, he's standing for more than himself. Most people won't see it, but soldiers do." Emily, clutching her phone but not raising it to record, gave a small nod, her brow furrowed as though she understood more than she could yet put into words. Further down the line, however, the tone was different. A pair of tourists, young men with cameras slung around their necks, whispered with smirks as they watched Rennick. "Bet he's not even real," one of them chuckled under his breath. "Like a wax figure from Madame Tussauds. What's the point standing there all day?" His friend laughed, raising his phone to zoom in for a selfie with the guard blurred in the background. "Statue in a funny hat, nothing more." Their laughter was quiet, but it drew disapproving glances from nearby parents. Respect was fragile, easily cracked by mockery, and their whispers cut against the atmosphere of solemnity. Yet, for the most part, the crowd understood the gravity of where they stood. Veterans in faded blazers adjusted their medals. Families spoke softly, aware that the man in scarlet standing stone still before them was not just part of the pageantry, but a symbol of something older and heavier. It was in this balance of reverence and curiosity, history and tourism, that the tension began to grow. For at the edge of the plaza, the smooth purr of an expensive engine had started to roll closer. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The black railings seemed to gleam sharper in the sunlight, as though anticipating what was about to come. Something was shifting in the air. The hum of the car grew louder, until it broke into full view. A gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom, its chrome grille catching the sunlight like a polished blade. It glided to a stop along the edge of the forecourt, just beyond where tourists clustered at the gates. The quiet murmur of the crowd dimmed almost instantly. Few vehicles ever appeared so close to the ceremonial ground during the changing of the guard, and those that did were usually official. This one looked different, too sleek, too ostentatious. The driver, a nervous man in a plain dark suit, stepped quickly from the front and hurried to open the rear door. He moved with the sort of caution of someone who lived permanently under the shadow of another man's temper. Out stepped Victor Alden. At 52, he carried himself with the assured arrogance of someone who had built an empire and grown accustomed to every door opening on command. His silver hair was cut short and swept back immaculately. His tailored navy suit, fitted with the precision of a craftsman, and a platinum watch gleamed on his wrist. Even the way he adjusted his cufflinks seemed calculated to draw the eye. He paused, looked around, and let out a sharp laugh. "This is it? Buckingham Palace?" His voice carried with startling ease across the forecourt. "All this fuss over a building and a few toy soldiers." The words sliced into the quiet like a cold wind. Heads turned. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. His assistant, a woman in her 30s with a navy skirt suit and an iPad pressed tight against her chest, hurried after him. Her name was Caroline, and she already wore the stiff smile of someone used to smoothing over his excesses. "Sir," she whispered quickly, "please, this is a ceremonial ground. Perhaps we should—" But Victor waved her off with a sharp flick of his hand. "Ceremonial," he sneered, drawing out the word as though it were an insult. A parade ground for tourists, nothing more. I've hosted conferences in Shanghai with more meaning than this. Rennick, standing firm at his post, did not so much as flicker an eyelid. His rifle rested clean and balanced against his shoulder, his eyes fixed in the practiced blankness of duty. Victor narrowed his gaze on him, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. Look at this one, marching in circles, staring at nothing. A wind-up toy and a silly hat. He chuckled, shaking his head. Imagine my engineers, men and women designing AI systems that run the world, being told their work means less than this performance. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Parents pulled children closer. A veteran muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. The mood that had, moments before, been one of quiet reverence was beginning to thrum with unease. Caroline tried again, her voice taut. Sir, with respect, this is the Royal Guard. They represent wasted potential. Victor cut in, his voice rising enough for half the courtyard to hear. Tradition for tradition's sake. We could program a robot to do this job. Cheaper, faster, never blinks. He smirked, and it wouldn't need to wear a circus costume. Gasps came sharper this time. A mother covered her young son's ears. Tourists lowered their phones, sensing that filming might make them complicit in something wrong. But Victor seemed to thrive on the discomfort, standing straighter as the weight of the courtyard's attention settled on him. His voice rolled out smug and deliberate. The world runs on innovation, not relics. And this, he gestured dismissively at Rennick, is nothing but theatre. The stillness of the guard did not waver. Yet beneath that silence, every witness could feel it. Something was building, coiling tighter with every word. Victor Alden was not a man used to silence. In boardrooms across 3 continents, his voice was enough to bend conversations, halt arguments, and draw nervous laughter from executives who feared being next on the chopping block. But here, on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, his words struck stone and marble and discipline, and were swallowed whole by a silence older and stronger than himself. And that silence infuriated him. He stepped closer to the ceremonial rope line, polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His driver lingered nervously near the Rolls-Royce, shoulders hunched, as if wishing he could sink into the car door. Caroline, his assistant, trailed at a distance, biting her lip as she glanced at the crowd. Phones were out now, but not to indulge Victor's show. They were lowered, recording only cautiously, as if no one quite wanted to be the first to capture sacrilege. Victor smirked at the sea of faces staring back at him. You see? Not one blink, not one twitch. He's a mannequin, a glorified statue in red cloth. He pointed directly at Rennick's rifle. And that weapon? Purely for show. My security detail carries better kit. At least theirs has a round in the chamber. Several murmurs rose from the onlookers, audible now, indignant. A man in a veteran's cap shook his head, muttering, "That's not just for show, son." A young mother pulled her daughter behind her, as if to shield her from the man's harsh voice. Still, Rennick did not move. Victor chuckled again, louder this time, leaning slightly over the rope. "Do you know what I pay my driver?" He looked toward the nervous man in the dark suit, who flushed crimson and turned away. "More than this so-called soldier earns in a year. And the driver doesn't have to stand in silence, dressed like a doll, pretending his work matters." Caroline's face paled. She stepped quickly to his side, her voice sharp in its whisper. "Sir, enough. This is not appropriate. These guards are not props." Victor cut her off, with a bark of laughter. "Props is all they are. Human statues. And do you know what the tragedy is? They believe it's meaningful. They believe that walking 21 steps and standing still makes them part of history. It's pathetic." The words drew a gasp from someone in the crowd, a schoolboy who had been clutching a souvenir flag. His father crouched down, whispering harshly, "Don't listen, son. He doesn't understand. Some men never do." But Victor wasn't finished. He stepped right up to the rope, close enough now that the guard's immovable figure towered over him. He tilted his head, studying Rennick's face as if inspecting a machine. "I wonder," he he said loudly, his tone dripping with mockery. "How much would it take to make you react? £10, 100, 1,000. Surely even a toy soldier has a price." The crowd bristled. Arthur Hale, the elderly veteran, clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles whitening. He muttered low to his granddaughter, "It's men like this who think money replaces honour. He'll find out the hard way." Victor pulled a crisp note from his wallet and waved it mockingly in the air. "Tell you what," he sneered, "say good afternoon, Mr. Alden, and I'll make it 1,000. Straight to you. No questions asked. Break your silence, toy soldier, and I'll prove what everyone here already suspects, that all tradition falls to money in the end." The crowd erupted in soft protests. Parents shook their heads. A man shouted, "Have some respect," from the back, and even Caroline's professional facade cracked. She grabbed Victor's arm, her voice trembling now. "Sir, stop this. You're humiliating yourself. This is the Royal Guard, not your employees." Victor shook her off roughly, his face reddening, his voice pitched to carry. "Humiliating myself? Number, I'm exposing a fraud. Watch!" He leaned even closer, his breath misting the polished brass buttons on Rennick's tunic. £1,000,000, he spat. "That's what I'll donate to any veterans' charity of your choice. Just say my name." The courtyard fell into a hush so deep it was as though the city itself had stopped breathing. A pigeon fluttered from the railing, the only movement breaking the stillness. Dozens of eyes fixed on Rennick, waiting, but the guard's silence held. His rifle gleamed in the sunlight, his boots remained planted, and his face was as unyielding as carved stone. Only a sharp muscle along his jaw betrayed the effort of control. Children clutched tighter to their parents. Veterans bristled with anger. And Victor Alden, feeling the weight of that silence pressing against him, began to tremble with rage. For a moment, it seemed Victor Alden might stop. His hand tightened around the banknote, his jaw worked, and his eyes flicked to the rows of faces staring at him with undisguised disgust. But pride had never let him back down in a boardroom, and it would not let him retreat here. He stepped forward. The velvet rope dipped under his stride, and the audible gasp that swept through the crowd might as well have been thunder. Tourists froze mid-breath. Parents clutched their children closer, and one woman raised her phone but lowered it again, almost ashamed to be recording what felt like sacrilege. "Now we'll see," Victor sneered, pacing onto the sacred stone where no civilian was meant to tread. "I've paid for boardrooms, for senators, for presidents. Why not for you?" His polished shoes scuffed the centuries-old paving, echoing too loudly in the charged silence. Caroline's voice cracked as she rushed to the rope, her hands outstretched in panic. "Sir, you can't, please, you are not allowed there." But he ignored her. He stopped directly in front of Guardsman Renick, so close now that he had to tilt his head to meet the soldier's steady gaze. Victor's voice lowered, but the sneer never left it. £1,000,000, he hissed. "That's the offer. Say my name. Acknowledge me, and you'll change more lives than you ever will standing here like a painted doll. Don't tell me you're too stupid to know the value of that." The silence that followed was suffocating. The courtyard, moments ago alive with murmurs and clicking shutters, was utterly still. Even the pigeons had abandoned the railings. Dozens of witnesses watched, some with mouths open, some with hands pressed over children's ears. The tension was unbearable. Then, against all expectation, the silence broke. Rennick stopped. His boots clicked once against stone as he shifted his stance, a tiny, deliberate movement that rang louder in the air than Victor's entire tirade. Slowly, his head turned, the bare skin casting shadow over eyes that now fixed directly on the billionaire. And then, in a voice steady and low, he spoke. "You are standing on ground guarded in honour of those who gave their lives," Rennick said, his words carrying clear across the courtyard. "Step back. Show respect." It was not shouted. It was not theatrical, but it landed with the weight of a hammer blow. The crowd gasped again, but this time it was not in outrage. It was in shock. A royal guard had spoken, breaking centuries of discipline to correct a man who had crossed a line no wealth could buy. Arthur Hale, the veteran, felt his throat tighten. He gripped his granddaughter's hand, whispering, "Did you hear that? That's duty speaking." Victor, however, laughed. A brittle, unhinged sound. "Respect," he spat, his face flushing red. "I fund this country. My companies power its networks, fuel its economy. Respect me." He jabbed a finger at Rennick's chest. "You don't tell me what to do. I own more than your entire regiment earns in a decade." But the guard did not move. His rifle remained balanced, his posture perfect, his words final. The silence returned, heavier now, thicker, pressing down on Victor until his voice sounded shrill against it. For the first time in his life, the billionaire's bluster had met something it could not bend, and in that unbearable tension, something inside him snapped. Victor's hand lashed out, sudden and vicious, the motion faster than even Caroline could cry out to stop. His palm struck across Rennick's cheek with a crack that reverberated off the palace walls. Gasps tore through the crowd, sharp and horrified. Children whimpered, parents pulled them back, and veterans surged forward before restraining themselves at the rope. Rennick did not move. The red mark bloomed stark across his pale cheek, but his bearing did not falter. His boots remained planted, his rifle steady, his eyes fixed forward once more as though carved in stone. Victor's chest heaved, his breathing ragged, but there was no satisfaction in his face. Only the sudden awareness that every pair of eyes in the forecourt was fixed on him, and none with respect. The moment of stillness hung, unbearably, unbreakably. And then the first security officer appeared. The echo of the slap seemed to hang in the summer air longer than it should have, reverberating across the courtyard, bouncing off the palace stone and sinking into every witness's chest. The red imprint of Victor Alden's hand stood out livid against Guardsman Thomas Rennick's cheek, yet the soldier did not so much as flinch. His jaw tightened, his posture remained unbroken, and his rifle balanced as though nothing had happened at all. That stillness, that refusal to give the slap meaning, was worse for Victor than any retaliation. He puffed his chest, but his voice cracked as he shouted into the silence, "Do you know who I am?" The crowd's response was not awe, but a chorus of disgust. Parents hissed, "Shame!" Veterans muttered curses under their breath. A man in a wheelchair, his chest heavy with medals, clenched his fists so hard his knuckles blanched white. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, eyes wide at the sight of a grown man striking a guard who had done nothing but stand. "Get him out of here," someone shouted. "He hit a soldier," another voice roared. "This is sacred ground." Victor spun, desperate, his face flushing crimson as jeers and shouts surged around him. He had entered expecting to dominate, to bend the moment to his wealth and power. Instead, he was drowning in contempt. Then came the heavy thud of boots. 2 palace security officers swept across the forecourt, their movements sharp, precise, and without hesitation. Their uniforms were dark, their expressions set in the stern neutrality of men who knew exactly what line had been crossed. One officer seized Victor's arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. The other stepped between him and Rennick, though the guard himself had not moved an inch. "Sir," the first officer said firmly, "you are under arrest for assaulting a serving member of the Royal Guard and for trespassing into a restricted ceremonial zone." Victor thrashed, his voice shrill now. "Unhand me! Do you know who I am? I'll have your jobs within the hour." But the officers did not so much as blink. Their grip tightened. Their boots clicked in unison as they forced him back toward the rope. Rennick, silent all this while, finally spoke again. His words were low, calm, but carried across the plaza with the authority of someone who had faced down fire and death in Helmand. "Your money doesn't matter here," he said. "Respect does." The effect was immediate. The crowd fell into stunned silence, the weight of those words pressing deeper than any shout could have. Caroline, Victor's assistant, stood frozen, her iPad clutched uselessly in her hands, her lips parted in shock. Even the driver looked stricken, his head bowed, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Victor's protests grew frantic, almost panicked. "I built companies that power your hospitals, your banks. My taxes fund your salaries. I own half the networks this country runs on." His voice cracked as the officers hauled him to the edge of the courtyard. "You can't do this to me. I am Victor Alden." But his words rang hollow. The crowd was no longer listening. Their eyes had shifted back to the man in scarlet and bearskin, whose cheek still bore the mark of arrogance, but whose stance remained unbroken. The contrast was unmistakable. One man flailing, desperate, undone by his own ego. The other silent, disciplined, a pillar against which nothing could shake tradition. A father knelt to his daughter, whispering softly, "Watch him. That's strength. Not the shouting, not the money. That." The girl nodded gravely, clutching her paper flag tighter. Arthur Hale, the veteran, straightened his back, a faint tremor in his voice, as he said to his granddaughter, "That's the measure of a soldier, Emily, to stand unyielding when the world tries to break you." The officers dragged Victor through the rope line, his expensive shoes scuffing against the pavement. He shouted threats about lawyers, about senators, about shareholders, but no one looked at him with fear anymore. They looked at him with pity. "And Rennick?" He resumed his march. 21 steps, pause, turn. Boots clicked on stone, rifle gleamed in sunlight. As though nothing, not even the sting of a billionaire's hand, could disturb the rhythm of his duty. The courtyard was quieter than it had been all morning. Even the chatter of distant tourists at the far end of the mall seemed muted, as if the very air around Buckingham Palace had chosen to bear witness. Guardsman Rennick's boots struck the paving stones with perfect precision once more, and every click echoed like a drumbeat of dignity. Victor Alden's shouts were fading now, muffled as the officers marched him toward the waiting security vehicle beyond the gates. His voice, so full of bravado minutes earlier, now carried a brittle edge of desperation. "You'll regret this! I'll buy this city. You'll all see." But each cry fell flatter than the last, drowned by the silence of the crowd that had turned its back on him. Eyes instead were fixed on the guard. Arthur Hale, the old veteran, stepped a little closer to the rope, his granddaughter still clutching his sleeve. He cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady, as he spoke just loudly enough for those around him to hear. "That man you just saw insulted a soldier who's carried more weight than he'll ever know. That guard, he's not here for a costume or a paycheck. He's here for the names we'll never read, for the men and women who never came home. That's what he's guarding." The words rippled through the onlookers like a current. Parents leaned down to explain them to their children. A young boy, who had been frightened by the shouting, asked his mother, "So he's a hero, Mum?" She nodded, her voice thick. "Yes, because he didn't need to fight back to prove it." A man in a wheelchair near the front raised his trembling hand in salute. His medals gleamed against his blazer, and though his arm shook, the pride in his eyes was steady as steel. Several others followed. Not salutes, but nods, folded hands and quiet murmurs of respect. Caroline, Victor's assistant, remained rooted where she stood. Her iPad hung limp at her side now, forgotten. She had spent years following her employer into boardrooms, where his arrogance was applauded, where his contempt was mistaken for strength. But here, watching a scarlet-coated soldier refuse to bend even after being struck, she saw the hollowness of wealth and the weight of something she couldn't quantify: tradition, honour, respect. Her eyes flickered to Rennick's scar, the faint line along his jaw, and for the first time in years she felt ashamed of the man she worked for. Rennick himself gave no indication of any of this. His face, marked red from the slap, remained unreadable. His rifle shifted shoulder with textbook precision, and his 21 steps continued without hesitation. But to those watching, the silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with meaning. Arthur's granddaughter Emily whispered, "Grandad, why didn't he hit back?" The old man's eyes glistened as he answered, "Because sometimes strength isn't about what you do. It's about what you refuse to do." The crowd absorbed that in silence, each person left to carry the meaning for themselves. Some wiped tears, others stood taller. For all of them, the sight of the royal guard resuming his march, face stinging, posture perfect, became more than ceremony. It became a lesson. And so, when the Rolls-Royce door slammed shut and the security vehicle carried Victor Alden away, it was barely noticed. What lingered was the sound of polished boots against stone, the gleam of brass buttons, and the unbroken line of a soldier who had stood firm against money, arrogance, and insult. The palace forecourt had returned to order, but the weight of what had been witnessed would remain with every soul present. The forecourt slowly settled back into the rhythm it had known for centuries. The echo of boots against stone, the gleam of scarlet tunics under the sun, and the silent dignity of the royal guard reclaimed the space. Leaves drifted from the nearby trees, carried across the plaza by a soft breeze, and for the first time in many minutes, the tourists found themselves hushed once more. Victor Alden was gone, his protests swallowed by distance, his power rendered meaningless in the face of tradition. What remained was the image of Guardsman Thomas Rennick, steady and unbroken, resuming his watch as though nothing had happened. The red mark on his cheek was still visible, but it seemed less a wound than a badge, a reminder that discipline could not be bought or broken. Parents gathered their children closer, explaining in whispers what they had just seen. Veterans stood straighter, some saluting quietly before turning away. And for those who walked back down the mall that morning, the memory they carried was not of arrogance, but of honour. The kind that needed no words, no wealth, only silence and resolve. In a world where money can shout and power can buy almost anything, there are still things beyond its reach. Respect, duty, and the quiet strength of those who guard them. What would you have done if you saw someone slap a royal guard? Do you think guards should stay silent no matter what? Or is breaking protocol sometimes the right choice? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you never miss a new one. Share this video with friends and family. And as our other stories appear on screen, watch them next. We'll see you tomorrow at the same time with a brand new story.